Welcome to the Bernina 880 Mastery Live. It's Lesson 3, Not Directionally Challenged with Susan Fierce.
Thanks, Catherine. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join us for Not Directionally Challenged. You may think that's an odd title for a program, but our Bernina 880 sews directionally in 360 directions even, but there's a lot of different ways that we can get there. So in our previous sessions, we've started with just getting to know the machine. We've looked at our 9mm stitches and all of the creative functions that we can apply to those and working with combinations. And in this session, we're going to work with directional stitches. So there are built-in stitches that are directional. Sideways motion stitches. We'll talk about some of the sewing tips that will help make this more successful for you. We're going to talk about sewing with distortion, which is a newer built-in feature on the Bernina 880. We're also going to look at multi-directional sewing with singles and combination sewing. And we're going to look at connecting stitches with drag and drop. All of these items put us in a directional situation. So when you are selecting stitches from your menus, you have some menus that have this little directional compass on it. That's an indication that you have a directional stitch menu. These are stitches that are larger than 9mm and will require sideways motion for the movement of the fabric in order for the stitch to stitch out. So with all of that happening, is there anything special that you should consider when you are setting up to sew for this? And there are some tips that I can pass along that we have found make this a little bit more successful and easier for you. Just like we spoke about last time, what kind of support does the fabric need? Does it need stabilizer or will starch do the trick for you? So that's going to depend on your fabric and the stitch selected. We find that drawing lines, multiple half-inch apart parallel lines, parallel to the foot, help you keep your foot straight because the fabric is going to be moving. The feed dogs are actually moving the fabric sideways in different angles, forwards and backwards, and your job is to keep the fabric straight. And the best way to know that is to keep the foot parallel to the drawn lines that you have made. And that's probably the best bit of advice I can give you. It's how I learned, and it really does make a huge difference. When you are sewing sideways motion stitches, you are always going to use foot number 40C. It will be recommended in the stitch altering, it'll be recommended on your presser foot selection area for you. It is never going to be a it's never going to be a dual feed operation. So those are some of the tips. If you want to verify that your stitch is sewing as you'd like for it to sew, you can always engage pattern end. Sew to the end of the pattern and then sort of check your work. And then if minute little adjustments need to be made, you could make that shift if you need to. Another tip is you're not going to be sewing these at full speed ahead. The feed dogs need time to move the fabric in order for the stitch to form. So I find that setting the speed control to about half is a good way to provide a medium and consistent speed throughout the sewing of my project. Then the stitches have time to form and you get a well-formed stitch and a beautiful stitch. So what are some of the sideways motion scenarios that you're going to have? Selecting stitches built into the machine is one. You will find those by the little directional compass on the folder. If you're in the alphabets, there is a large monogram folder there, and it will sew directionally. We'll take a look at that. Anytime that you engage the multi-directional function, and this is in the information menu, we'll also see where this is and we will show how this affects some of your stitches. You can also apply it to a combination. Anytime you use drag and drop, which we haven't talked about yet, so we'll look at how this awesome feature works and how it puts you into a sideways motion scenario. And then anytime we use distortion, that becomes sideways motion. All of these situations are going to require foot number 40C for stitching, and then you can decide what other types of preparation needs that you need to make, such as do you need lines drawn or do you need extra stabilizer. The sideways motion stitches are really quite lovely, and of course they're never more lovely than when they are on fabric. So if you've not seen these stitched out, spend a little time sewing on them because they are much larger than the little thumbnail views than you see built into on the screen. And they vary in size between 13 millimeters all the way up to 45 millimeter. So some of them can be quite large. This is what the large monograms will look like. We'll see take a look at this also. And in multi-directional sewing, this is the icon that you can engage for 9 millimeter stitches to create a sideways motion scenario, or by working with a combination. But this, probably the most important thing about this, is it allows you to sew an angled stitch but not angling the fabric. So your fabric is actually straight, but the foot is actually traveling in the programmed direction that you have set. And so we'll take a look at some different ways that you can accomplish this. And then lastly, we will look at what is distortion and what can that do for you. So right now we're going to go to our simulator. This is what you can download from the Bernina website, and then you can have this on your computer to play along with. But of course you've got the machine, so only if you need to take something with you on your laptop maybe would you want to try this. So taking a look in our decorative stitch menu, the menus that have the little compass, these are your directional stitch menus. Remember, you can scroll or you can use the transition to see all of your folders. By selecting one of the stitches, you'll notice the stitches displayed in the stitch altering area or the on-screen view in relation to the presser foot. You'll also notice that the presser foot recommendation is now foot 40C, as it should be because this is a sideways motion stitch. Now you are not being able to see all of the stitch, so an icon in the left-hand corner of the screen shows you or allows you to select Fit to Window. When you select Fit to Window, it shows you the entire pattern. The little white dot shows you where the needle point is going to start. The little red plus is going to show you where it ends. I like to think of that as an X for exit, so that's your exit point for your needle. Some of the stitches, see, when you select the giant wave, you really don't see enough of it to really know much about that. What you do see, though, is the stitch in relationship to the foot, and you know that the majority of the stitch is going to happen to the right of the foot. So you want to be sure that you have fabric there in order for the stitch to sew. So that's where the actual view of the stitch on screen can be very helpful and useful to you in planning your projects. Let's take a look at where the large monograms are. So here we have our large monogram A. It's a very beautiful scripty alphabet. It shows me that it's going to start in the little curlicue of the bottom part of the A, but I don't even see the rest of the letter until I look at or set Fit to Window. And each of the stitches will be a little bit different as to how much you can see without Fit to Window engaged. If we look at our information screen, this is where these icons change depending on the stitch selected. You'll also notice that the alphabet icon that you have allows you to select this in 3 different stitches. So you can work with it in large, small, or medium. And it starts at 30 millimeters large, the medium is 20, and the small is 10. So there's a range here that you can work with. And again, foot number 40C is required. Let's take a look at some stitches. So I'm going to work with just a basic 9 millimeter stitch, number 644. You may even recognize this stitch. And right now I would sew this with foot number 1C. It's going straight ahead. But if I select multi-directional, because I want to sew this at an angle because that's the easier way for my fabric to be, let's say I select 35, now it's telling me I need to put on foot 40C to sew this. Sideways motion foot number 40C comes with your machine. It is the only foot designed to sew sideways motion. So it's always the one you want to pick. So this is exactly what would happen. We would start here and the machine would start to stitch out in an angle of 135 degrees. Let's look at what if we want to stitch something different? Now, it would not stitch just one. It would stitch this and continue going. Let's look at stitch 656. Again, 1C, straight out. As soon as I turn on an angle, I get this pattern. Let's say I want to stitch this, and then I want to create maybe like a zigzag of these patterns. Well, an easy way to do this is to select the I breadcrumb, turn on pattern repeat of 1, go back to multi-direction, and then sew this. So we would sew and it would begin to stitch. So if we watch it on the screen, you'll see it's beginning to form my stitch, and you'll see the little S sewing off in the direction of 135 degrees. And it'll continue on this path, and you can see where the needle is. The little white dot is showing you where you are in the pattern, and if you were to look up at the screen while you were sewing, you would know exactly how much of the stitch you had left. So we set this to sew one pattern. It's going to stitch all of the pattern and stop at the little red plus or X. And now what I'm going to do is when it completes sewing, I'm going to change directions on it. So now I want it to sew in direction 225. So you can see on screen where one stitch has sewn. Let's start sewing the next one. So I'm going to touch the little foot control on my simulator, and it's going to begin sewing the stitch again, and you can see how it reacts with the stitch on the fabric. So that is stitching one pattern at a time and creating a little zigzag pattern of this pattern on my fabric. So you can see how multi-direction is pretty cool. The way I've been using it is to select each of the different nodes. And I'm going to go ahead and stop this, is to select each of the nodes that have been preset. But you can also use the plus or minus if you want it to stitch at any angle. So you have 1 degree incremental changes. The icon with the hand and the little white knobs shows you that you can use either one of the stitch width or the stitch length knobs to affect the angle of how the stitch is sewing. So with this screen open, you could select a stitch and you could turn the knobs while you are sewing, and the machine would react to exactly what you were doing on the fly. So it's a really fun way to get kind of a free motion look that's really not free motion, but it has a real fun, wavy, and very organic type of look. So we've set this up and we sewed it individually. But we can also set this up as a combination and program it. So if I go into my combi mode, and let's go back to 656, and I'm going to program that to 135. I'm going to go back to the 656 and put a second one in, go into the information screen, select multi-direction. The one that is highlighted is the active stitch. It's also highlighted in the menu. It is blue in your realistic view of the stitch area. And I move this to 225. Now I have exactly what this is going to sew like. If I go into modify screen for a bigger view, you can see what this would look like on the preview on your fabric. So it's a really fun way to work, and you can see how you can set this up as a combination versus doing it one stitch at a time. So 2 ways to work. It's a very fun combination. So let's look at working with sideways motion stitches in combinations. So if you remember from last time, anytime you have a combination on screen, we could save this, but we just want to delete this and give us a fresh page. You can select all and select the trash can and check to confirm. And now we can start adding something else that's new. So I'm going to put in 1055 and check, and I'm going to go to that menu and start looking for some other stitches to put in with it. And I'm going to put in a 1050 and a 1050. Another thing to remember is when you put a stitch in, or you selected a stitch that you didn't really want to be there, you can pull to the side, just touch it and move to the right, and it will delete by swiping. So now I just have my 2 stitches. We're going to go into our modify screen view, and if this were to stitch out singly, this is what you would get, and it looks great. It's all connected, and that's a great look. You also have an information icon on this screen which allows you to affect different areas here as well. So the stitch that's highlighted is stitch number 1. I'd like to select stitch number 2. And I'm going to mirror image this side to side. And that's a pretty cool looking pattern, but when it goes from pattern 1 to pattern 2, you're going to have a gap. You're actually going to have a piece of thread that connects the end point of stitch of pattern 1 to the start point of pattern 2, which you'll have to either live with because there won't be a knot, or you'll have to put knots in there. So you have a very cool feature called drag and drop. And I'm going to close this to give us a little bit more space to work. Drag and drop is physically touching the screen with your fingertip or stylus and moving this until they match up. Now I'm using my mouse to do this, and now I can see in my preview screen that this all lines up perfectly. That's exactly what I want to sew. Then there is no strange stitch that I have to live with or figure out what to do with. So this is what we call using connecting stitches. We are using something called drag and drop. It's a wonderful feature. We're the only ones who can do this, so this is way cool. So you certainly want to take advantage of this great feature. We're going to close the Modify screen. It has put in the little compass directions, the move motions that it needs to make in order to sew out what you drew on screen. And this is so awesome because you didn't have to figure out the angle that the stitches need to go. So we love it when the machine works for us and helps us. It's also telling me foot number 40C. These were sideways motion stitches to start with, but they are definitely sideways motion now because you have this in your combination. So let's take a look at saving this. So we want to close out of we don't need to close anything. We want to select Personal Program. You want to look for the folder with the arrow going into the folder, and you want to select the combination that is highlighted, and now it has been saved away to memory. To delete this from the screen, you want to select All and select the trash can and confirm. It is still saved in the memory, but now we have a fresh screen to work with. Let's look at another combination that we want to set up. And this is a combination we're going to work with from the cross-stitch menu. And we're going to look for stitch number 376. So I'm going to select 1 and select 2. You will find that you can make some very dynamic stitch combinations just by selecting the pattern twice and mirror imaging the second one, and then setting them up to sew together. So you don't always have to spend time trying to come up with 2 or 3 stitches that look good together. This is a really nice way to work. So we're going to go into Modify Screen. We're going to select the information icon. The second stitch was the last thing that we did something to, so it happens to be the one selected. So we're going to mirror image this side to side, and this time we can use the stylus or the fingertip, or you can use your knob. So I want to move this to the left, so I'm going to use the minus, and I'm just turning my knobs. But I also want to move this up. I want this to connect a little bit. So I'm going to move this, continue moving it over, moving it up, and so till I have a design that's created like you see on my screen. Anytime that you move the design vertically, backwards or forwards, you run the risk of creating a gap in the stitch, because instead of it being one unit right after another, you've overlapped it in some way, so you've created a hole right here. But there's a way to close off this gap, and this is very cool, so that's what we're going to look at next. You want to keep everything the way it is. So the information screen needs to be open. You want to select the stitch number 1 in your combination, and you want to select a tool called Move Multiples. That tends to select everything, and you're going to watch the preview area. And you're going to use your stitch length knob only, and you do want to do this with the stitch length knob. This is not a drag and drop situation. It's only with your stitch length knob. And you're going to use the turn to the right or the plus until you see the gap close and go away on your preview screen. Once you see that, you are finished. You can select the Modify screen icon, and now you are ready to stitch this out, and you're able to stitch this without any gaps, and that's what we wanted to achieve in this stitch combination. So let's save this. So we're going to go to our personal program, we're going to select Save, If you want to save this over top of something, like I already have one here saved, you will get the overriding icon. So this is a great way to help manage your memory so that you don't get too many things or too bogged down. You can overwrite instead of deleting and saving. So we can overwrite this on top of another combination and it is now saved away. To delete this from the screen, select all, select the trash can, check to confirm, and now we can start again. The stitches that we used the last time were 2 9mm stitches. And we use drag and drop, and we use the move multiples. But the same effect can happen with sideways motion stitches in a combination. So we're going to work with our sideways motion stitches in our 500 menu, and we're going to work with stitch number 518 and 524. So you can select 518 and 524. These are already large enough that I really can't see everything. We may as well just go on ahead to modify screen. And this is when you're going to take a look at the combination and see, how can I make this look really cool? How can I make this sew out and be better than what it looks like here? So we're going to open the eye. We're going to turn off move multiples. We're going to select stitch number 1 and we're going to move it top to bottom, or change the mirror to top to bottom. Then I'm going to select stitch number 2. We're going to mirror image this side to side, and then we're going to drag and drop so that this little curly Q comes out of the intersection of the other curly Q. Now I was just dragging and dropping vertically, so I have created a tiny gap in my large preview, which you can see here. It's not a big gap, and it could go unnoticed, and even if it were a jump stitch, it probably wouldn't be awful. But we can make it better, so let's do that. So we are going to need to use move multiples. When you use move multiples, you want to select the first stitch in the combination so that it is blue. Select move multiples, then use your your stitch length knob to move the pattern so that they vertically close up. And I'm turning the dial to the right so that I have released or removed that gap. And that's exactly what we want to have happen. So now we are finished here. We can close out of modify screen, and now we could sew this. Now anytime that you are sewing sideways motion stitches, it can be challenging because you've got a lot going on. I've already talked to you about how it's going to move in 360 degrees possibly. It's going to sew off at angles. You're going to have to help guide the fabric, and you're going to be guiding it with your fingertips. You want the feed dogs to do all the work. It's going to put the fabric in the right place for the stitch. But there's another way that you can get this onto fabric. The other way is to embroider it. So let's take a peek into taking this stitch into embroidery. So we're going to select the house. We're going to select embroidery. All of your stitches that you bring over from sewing will always be found in your My Designs folder. They're going to be pink, and you select it. Here is our stitch that we just created. Great, I have my pattern. I'm going to want more than one of those. So this is a preview of some of the things you're going to see when we get to embroidery. I'm going to select a bigger hoop, select the information and endless embroidery, and now I can embroider this pattern out in my hoop, and I don't have to worry about things lining up. The embroidery is going to take care of that for me. This is just a little preview of what we're going to see when we get into embroidery. We do have some other exercises to do in embroidery than just this, but this is another way that you can work with stitches, and you can sew them or embroider them, and it's great that you have these options. Let's go back into our sewing side of the screen. We're still back at our combination. To take a stitch into embroidery, the only thing that needs to have happened is that it's visible in your stitch altering area. That's all you need to have happen. It does not have to be saved first. It just needs to be here. So that's basically everything there is to know about working with sideways motion stitches, where they are, what they look like, how to find them, how to work with multi-directional, how to work with drag and drop and move multiples. The other thing I do want to show you is a little bit about distortion. So let's go ahead and this is actually, distortion is not a combination effect. So we're going to just shut off our combi mode. It takes you back to where you last were. We want to work with the regular stitches, so I'm going to select the decorative stitch tab, and you want to select the 400 menu. And if you take a look at the stitches here, you see a lot of compact satin stitches. You also see some open stitches. The ones that are going to work the best for you are going to be the ones that are the compact satin stitches, but I don't want to scare you away from trying some of the others. You will know if they sew out well. You'll be able to tell. So try others. If you are familiar with the 830 term balance bonus, Distortion is the next generation of that. It has been more refined. It has its own icon. It's not a hidden feature, and I believe it works with more stitches, and you have more incremental changes that you can make to it, so you have, I think, a little bit better control. But let's say that we're going to select one of my favorite stitches for this is stitch number 427. Select your stitch first. If I were stitching this regular, stitch number, foot number 1C is called for. When I go to the information screen and select Distortion, what's going to happen here, and this you can see the different hand positions by the knobs, and this is the difference between selecting the upper knob and the lower knob. I find that in Distortion you want to select the upper knob only, or the stitch width knob. As soon as you start adjusting the baseline or the distorting the stitch, this turns to foot number 40C because it is now a sideways motion stitch. When you are sewing this, you're actually turning the stitch width dial while you're sewing, and that is what is going to create a wavy baseline. You can turn this dial, you're watching your fabric is straight, but your feed dogs are moving the fabric in this distorted way, causing the baseline to wave. And you can create all kinds of really terrific looking techniques. So all of these stitches, with the exception of the one on the far left, are all from menu 401. And these are beautiful stitches to try, and you can see the different looks that you can get. So by turning the knob to the right, the stitches curve to the right. By turning it to the left and into the negative column, then they will go to the left, and you can see how you get this really beautiful waved pattern, and it's a wonderful way to add accents into your projects. On the handout that you'll have with this, I'll give you some stitches to try. This stitch out that's over here on the left is one that surprised me. I just tried it to see. It's stitch number 711. It's the little star that we all love and like. And it's stitched out very well too. You'll note stitches, you'll either like them or you won't. So that's pretty much the mark of, is it a good stitch to work with? So this pretty much completes our exercises for working with directional stitches, directional sewing techniques, and on your handout you will also have the directions for some other exercises just to get you in the practice of working with this and get you to where you're very comfortable with trying this out. And I hope that you will join us for our next session, which is more stitches with the Stitch Designer. So in the last session and this session, we have focused on built-in stitches with the built-in functions. Our next session focuses on creating your own stitches with the Stitch Designer, so you can have more. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much.